Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, viewers, wherever you are joining us for the final panel of what has proven to be a great conference for the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. There's been a lot of great discussions on a lot of different topics, and kind of to wrap things up and also to kind of put some additional context and perspective, we wanted to include the military history team for the consortium and provide some historical perspective on where the roots of some of these U.S. alliances, some of what history teaches us, and some other perspectives that history might provide, both for the current situation and the current dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, but also for where we might be going. And I know this is a topic that's been touched on in several of the panels already. And so in some ways, it's actually a really good segue or a really good kind of place setter for what we're going to be talking about here. We've got a great panel. It's the consortium's military history team. I will introduce each one of them briefly in the order that they will present, and then we'll kick off and just go through the presentations. And at the end, we'll have a discussion. I've got a few questions, and then also we can have a conversation amongst ourselves too. First up is going to be Captain Brendan Donnelly, who is an Air Force officer, Air Force ROTC graduate, and a fellow here at the consortium and part of the military history team, currently stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. Following him will be Lieutenant Grant Willis, who is also an Air Force officer, also an Air Force ROTC graduate, and he is stationed out at Cannon Air Force Base. And then last, but most definitely not least, is José Custodio, who is also a fellow at the consortium, as is Grant, as is Brendan. José is a noted defense commentator, originally from Manila, joining us now from California. Noted defense commentator on many Pacific-related issues, and of course, very conversant in the U.S.-Philippine alliance. And so it's looking forward to the discussion, fellas. I'm going to get out of the way. Brendan, I'm going to throw it over to you to kick us off.
All right. Well, I bring up my slides and start screen sharing. I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a different topic than some of the other people in the conference so far. I think a lot of the topics have really been China focused, Taiwan focused. So I wanted to put in a plug for what I would consider something called third party intervention. So if a Taiwan conflict was to go to start between the United States, China, and Taiwan, then Russia and the People's Republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or also known as North Korea, could be some of those third-party players in that conflict as well. And that's what I wanted to kind of focus on. And towards the end, I'll talk a little bit more about the present state of the relations, but I wanted to give a brief overview of the historic relations between the DPRK and Russia. So I'll be going by groupings of decades. So the 1950s and 1960s, so after World War II, and then moving into the 1970s and 90s, the early 2000s, present day, and kind of how Russia and North Korea are reacting to the Ukraine war, and then my own personal future analysis for what those relationships are going to look like. A quick timeline of going through the decades. I wanted to highlight some of the key players. So Kim Il Sung is right above the 1950 portion. Mao Zedong, Mikhail Gorbachev, President Vladimir Putin, and then Kim Jong Un. And those are kind of the people spanning the slide right now. And then in the bottom left, we have a key event with the Korean War. And then, of course, in the bottom right, we have another key event, which is ongoing, which is the war going on between Russia and Ukraine. So I'll be referencing each of these as each of these players has truly, I would say, gravitationally shifted the relationship between Russia and North Korea the most. And so I know that there are other people that have been a part of this timeline, especially with the Soviet Union. There were multiple different uh, basically rulers over the Soviet Union for that time. It's not just Mao Zedong. I know we also have Xi Jinping, but these are the people that I really wanted to focus on at first. So the 1950s and 1960s, to give truly the scope, the Soviet Union was the first to recognize North Korea, the DPRK, as the sole authority over Korea in 1948. So reason being is because after Japan surrendered to the United States in 1945, we then had kind of a split like we saw in East and West Germany. Um, the United States occupied South Korea, or what was now known as South Korea, and then the Soviet Union occupied what is now North Korea. And so we see that's the beginning of what the relationship truly was at the time. Between the 1950s and 1960s, we see a few different rulers or leaders over the USSR. So, of course, Joseph Stalin, Melanov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Leonid Brezhnev. So, and I call these out because during the 1950s and 60s, there's truly only one leader for the DPRK, and that's Kim Il Sung. So, uh, the other part of this timeline is I didn't include this, but it's also key to note that between the 1950s and 1960s, we have a number of different U.S. presidents as well, and so that's where as I continue talking, the relationship between the United States and DPRK also changes, and the relationship with Russia also changes because of comparatively, the United States leadership does change more than especially the North Koreans. But when Kim Il Sung originally came in and took over for the DPRK, he acted a lot like Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin really rose to power um, by taking out his opponents, and taking out as meaning killing his opponents or just making them disappear. And Kim Il Sung uh, really operated in that similar way of if there is an opponent, then that opponent just needs to leave, and it is a very authoritarian like tactics. Now the relationship between DPRK and the USSR at the very beginning was truly like the USSR was a parent, uh, because especially as I mentioned, one of the key events is the Korean War. Kim Il Sung sought the approval of the USSR of Joseph Stalin to actually start the conflict, and that's kind of where then after the Korean War, Kim Il Sung really tried to separate the DPRK from kind of the reliance of the USSR. Um, and then as we move in a little bit later in these decades, we have the Sino-Soviet split, where, like I said, Mao Zedong, and once we move past Joseph Stalin and Melanchov, we go into Nikita Khrushchev. And the Sino-Soviet split really is where we see the DPRK trying to balance both um, the People's Republic of China and the USSR. They don't really want to anger either side because it's between the PRC and the USSR at this time, and this is more Mao Zedong was I mean basically murdering some of his people, but then Nikita Khrushchev also had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Mao Zedong identified as like a huge blunder, and criticized Nikita Khrushchev for how he was interacting with the West. But then Nikita Khrushchev then identified that Mao Zedong's more aggressive tactics were ultimately going to start a nuclear war. And so that's where during the 1950s and 60s, the DPRK's relationship with the USSR, in the beginning of these two decades, they're one in the same lockstep. But then as we move on, the relationship between the USSR and China really kind of degrades some of those relationships. In the 1970s and 1990s, so again, we have the tail end of Leonid Brezhnev, but then we have a couple more Soviet Union leaders that come along. And then toward the end of the 1990s, moving into the 2000s, we'll see Kim Jong Il as well. But in the 70s, that's where after the Sino-Soviet split, we see the USSR and China reopen relationships after the Cultural Revolution from Mao Zedong. But at the same time, this is also where Kim Il Sung is trying to distance himself and distance DPRK from a reliance of economic aid, of military aid, and from influence from the Russians and the Chinese. And this is also where we see the United States coming in a little bit with President Richard Nixon trying to open up relations with China, and especially with Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s and 1990s, he had a very more Western way of looking, trying to work with the West, and Kim Il Sung was not about that. He did not want to increase relationship with the West, and so this is truly where we see the DPRK was ousting some of the pro-Russian and pro-PRC leadership in the DPRK leadership, which just completely diverts the relationship. Even though Kim Il Sung was trying to decrease that independence um, from Russian and Chinese aid. Sorry, that's a typo there. But the Chinese were still providing that aid throughout a lot of these different rifts in time to the DPRK. And then in the 2000s, so that's where after the fall of the Soviet Union, um, I didn't list the leaders here, but the DPRK, so that we'll have Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il. So Kim Jong-il first. But in the early 2000s, that's where there's a relationship that is being built again from with Russia, and so in the early 2000s, and that's with President Putin in kind of seeing the United States as an adversary. So the DPRK and the Russians are kind of saying, okay, we'll be friends because we see the United States as an adversary. But then towards the later part of the 2000s, so around the 2010s, um, we see Kim Jong Un coming in and wanting nuclear weapons. So that's why I put in a picture of nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles. And so this is where the relationship, although is still there, Putin accepts um, sanctions against the DPRK because they are looking at obtaining nuclear weapons or proliferation. So we're seeing more aggressive stances from the DPRK moving into what the United States would call as a rogue nation, because they're trying to have nuclear weapons, and the Russians were not comfortable with that because it's the DPRK and Kim Jong Un and Kim Jong Il, I guess would be considered not as stable leaders. Um, uh, from what they've seen, they've been going through a lot of famine, and realistically, their military is their prime objective. Um, Moving into present day, I would also say in kind of the mid 2010s is we saw a couple more sanctions coming from Russia onto the DPRK because of the nuclear proliferation program that they were looking at. So China has been supporting that, but the relationship after about 2016, moving into 2018 and into the 2020s, we saw a little bit more of a rise in the relationships in the relationship between the Russia and North Koreans. And so I'll talk about it here, and I'll move on to the Ukraine portion in a second. But really, throughout history, and I wanted to paint this picture now, is that at the very beginning, I'll take it as a roller coaster analogy. At the very beginning, we see a high of relationship between the USSR and the DPRK. And then afterwards, we see the DPRK trying to get more independence once we see in the 1970s and 1990s. And so we see a dip, and the relationship goes down. And then once there's a more common enemy, which is the United States in the early 2000s, and a change of leadership with Putin and Kim Jong Il, we see an increase in relationship, and now it's wavered a little bit in the 2010s and later in the mid 2010s, but now we're seeing a significant increase because now that Russia has the Ukraine war going on right now, the relationship probably couldn't is at an all-time high because these are just a couple of headlines, but it's that right now South Korea, Japan, the United States condemn North Korea's supply of arms to Russia, but that is critical aid that's going to Russia right now, and as long as the Ukraine war is going on, DPRK and the Russian relationship is honestly just going to increase. The relationship with China is also going to get stronger as well, and so we're seeing that high. And with that point, the kind of that roller coaster analogy I was talking about, I'll put into my future analysis. And so that historic waiver, that's that first point there, is with the changes in leadership and the changes of economic status and kind of their actions. That's where that roller coaster, that waiver has actually gone on. But now that we have consistent leadership between Putin and Kim Jong-un, and the war in Ukraine, that relationship will maintain. But even more future thinking, what I would say is in the next 10 years, the relationship between the DPRK and Russia is going to be tested, because, and I'll say this, because of the relationship between the Republic of Korea, so South Korea, and the United States. So as what I would consider the northwestern portion of the Pacific, as the United States gains more foothold with Japan, the integration with Japan, the integration with the ROK, the DPRK is going to be more provocative. They're going to be more hard standing on their rhetoric towards the United States and the ROK, and that's where that test is going to happen. Are the Russians actually going to support some of this hardline rhetoric coming from the DPRK, or are they going to say no? That's not exactly what we want out of this relationship. They don't want to poke the bear of the United States and potentially start something when they truly want to focus on some other priority. So I guess overall, my answer would be is I think in the near term, the relationship between Russia and DPRK is only going to get stronger. But in the future, I think that there's going to be a dip in relationships. I'm talking a decade, maybe 15 years in the future. I guess that's my overall analysis, brief description of what the relationship between Russia and DPRK has looked like, and what I think the history really says about what the relations in the future are going to look like. And as for time, I will close there, and I'll wait for questions until the end. But thanks for letting me present.
Thank you very much, Brendan. We'll let Grant bring up his slides, and he can proceed.
All right. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, great. Let me just go ahead and go to full screen there. All right, cool. All right. And good evening, everybody. So, like I was stated, my name's First Lieutenant Grant Willis, U.S. Air Force. I think Brendan had a lot of good points to segue into this talk, certainly between the PRC and USSR relationship. So, without further ado, let's get going here. So we got consequences of context. So really what we want to do with this section of the portion here is talk about the strategic relationship between the United States and certain Pacific powers with the application of land-based air power. I'm an Air Force officer. Brendan knows this about me too. It's like I would be remiss without saying that I love talking about land-based air power when it comes to the Pacific. We've talked about it several times. Three things I want to, connect this talk with the overall greater picture here is this. The first one being, what kind of effect do you want to create on the adversary? That's the first question that you got to ask here. The second is, there are consequences to pre-war force disposition. We'll get into the consequences of that here in a second. And then also the third thing that has a lot to do with what's going on today, crisis creates opportunity. And you'll see that with the third case study that we're going to use here. But without further ado, the Department of Defense disclaimer here, views and opinions expressed and applied in CIPR are those of the authors and should not be construed as carrying the official sanction of the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, Air Education Training Command, Air University, or other agencies, departments of the U.S. government, and all their international equivalents. All the information presented and opinions expressed are influenced and based on open source and unclassified material. Okay, as long as we got that one out of the way, that's great. All right, so overview. What we're going to be talking about, we're going to talk about what is the current dilemma right now. What's the biggest problem that I see in relation to land-based air power in the Pacific? Then we'll go into the history. We got three case studies we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about 1941 and the American Far East Air Forces in the Philippines. We're also going to skip ahead a couple days in that iteration in December 1941 with Force Z. That's the Royal Navy Task Force out there that was sent. And then we'll end it with a couple years after that into the Cold War, post-World War II, in the Second Taiwan Crisis of 1958. And then we'll talk about some lessons learned and applied, and then we'll get some questions at the end of this overall discussion. So first off, we got to ask ourselves what the current problem is in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to conventional forces in relation to strategic partnerships. So I love this quote. General William Depew, Vietnam veteran and also really instrumental in the reforming of the U.S. military post-1973. What can be seen can be hit. What can be hit can be killed. In our modern era with satellite technology, with multi-spectrum, multi-domain, and reconnaissance capabilities, our near-peer adversaries have caught up. They have the capability of seeing us just as much as we can see them, and we have to assume that their targeting is as good as ours. So we need to be able to maneuver properly with that. And what does that do to a really, really surreal picture like this? This is actually from a U.S. Naval Institute publication. This actually never happened. It's a Nimitz-class carrier getting smoked. But this is the kind of image that we don't want to see, right? This is the kind of image that we want to avoid. So what kind of future does naval air power have compared to land-based air power in the Pacific against current threats that we see from certain state actors in the Western Pacific that shall go unnamed, but we all know who it is? Going into the history behind how to avoid that picture that we just saw. December 1941, in the Philippines, the United States possessed the largest concentration of American air power outside the continental United States in Luzon in the Philippines, as well as other air bases across the archipelago. The Far East Air Force under General MacArthur's overall USAF command possessed a lot of firepower compared to what was known in 1941. They had B-17 long-range bombers, P-40 interceptors. They had multiple squadrons spread out throughout the archipelago. And on December 8th, across the international dateline, while the U.S. Pacific Fleet was still burning under smoke from its attack by the Japanese carrier force at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also struck Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, as well as the U.S. garrison in the Philippines. One of the first targets that the Japanese went after was the American land-based air power there. So what does it mean to lose that air superiority so quickly like that? You know, these guys have been on alert for a couple days. They hadn't gotten off the ground. They took off in the early morning hours of December 8th on their combat air patrols, didn't see anything, came back to land. And in classic fashion, right when they landed, that's when the Zeros started to come overhead. The dive bombers dove in, and they destroyed the majority of the combat power of the Far East Air Force in a matter of hours. Some units were able to scatter. Some units were able to get up and defend themselves and courageously do some dogfighting there and get some losses incurred on the enemy. But the main problem is that we as an Air Force were caught on the ground in the Philippines. We were destroyed effectively and rendered combat ineffective. And we had some sporadic units that went back to the Bataan Peninsula and dispersed air bases and tried to do what we could. But really, we lost air power in the very, very beginning stages of that campaign. So what does that look like when you lose that air parity? What does that look like when you don't no longer have the capability to even have air parity over the beachhead? How do you stop an amphibious assault? That happened at Lingayen Gulf. What do you do to really protect your troops on the ground? And the U.S. Air Force normally doesn't have that issue. They've had very few case studies where they had to be under air attack constantly without any sort of effect from their side. And the Philippines in 1941 gives you that kind of case study that we want to really dive into. And if we had time, I really would. But to go into that case study is really beneficial for our joint force today in trying to learn what land-based air power can do for us or what it can not do for us if it's taken away. And to move on from that, a day or two later on December 10th, 1941, you have the opposite effect, right? You have the effect of Japanese land-based air power being used against the Royal Navy as a instrument of instruction to those who still believed that the battleship reigned supreme, that air power was not going to eclipse the day of the mighty battle wagon, the dreadnought. On December 10th, in a matter of hours, 85 land-based bombers, twin-engine bombers from the Imperial Japanese Navy, they were land-based components, taking off out of air bases in Saigon, found and destroyed Force Z. So this was Winston Churchill's primary instrument of power in the Pacific at the time. You had HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales go down pretty dramatically in this fight. They had organic AAA anti-aircraft fire that was supposed to doctrinally save them from a concentration of air power, and it just goes to show you that Murphy's Law takes effect in situations like this when you're not expecting it early on in a war, and the consequences of that can be pretty traumatic. So Force Z was destroyed. The amphibious force from the Japanese was able to land, and the surrender at Singapore ended up being the largest surrender in British military history. So, along with in 1941 in the Philippines, in 1942 in May, you had the surrender at Corregidor after April 9th, and the surrender of Bataan, the largest U.S. surrender in U.S. military history. So just goes to show you the consequences of air power and the applications of it are dramatic. And let's skip forward a little bit. Let's go to the Cold War. So in the Cold War, we have the Second Taiwan Crisis in 1958, and specifically the almost near implementation of OP Plan 2558. This is a crisis that's understudied, in my opinion. This is where, I originally talked about crisis creates opportunity, right? Just to give you a little timeline of the year 1958, you had some interesting stuff going on in the Middle East that should ring alarm bells to parallels to today. Abd al-Karim Qasim, general in the Iraqi army, pulled off a coup in Baghdad on 14 July 1958. The British are occupied with that, trying to figure out how they're going to make sure Kuwait doesn't become the 19th province of Iraq in 1958. And then you also have a crisis in Lebanon. The Marines actually hit the beach with a combined task force with the Army and the Marine Corps, as well as a large U.S. naval presence there, comprising of a couple aircraft carriers. Sounds kind of familiar. Operation Blue Bat begins on 15 July 1958. So you've got multiple crises going on, and Mao Zedong sees an opportunity to try and force the issue of these outlining islands off the coast of mainland China, which is under communist control, against a couple of these islands that still remain under nationalist control over Chiang Kai-shek. After the Chinese Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek took his nationalist forces that were left, retreated to Taiwan, reconsolidated, regrouped, had some significant American assistance. If you look at the corner up here next to this map that I displayed for you guys, you can see this really cool patch. It's got the USTDC, the United States Taiwan Defense Command. That was an actual military organization that the United States set up on Taiwan. You can see on the map right next to it where Taiwan is located in relation to the mainland, and you can see all of the American bases that used to be on Taiwan at that time. And a new tactical doctrine from the United States Air Force had been created for brush fire crises, in which tactical air power was going to be hodgepodged, put together, and quickly deployed forward to different crisis locations, armed with conventional and nuclear capabilities. So tactical atomic weapons. So you can see this F-3D Skyray sitting here. You can see them loading up weapons right now on that flight line there. And just below that, you can see an A4 with an atomic bomb attached to it. This composite airstrike force was supposed to be able to deploy forward and was used for the first time in Operation Blue Bat in the Middle East and Turkey to deter the United Arab Republic of Syria and Egypt at the time with the Lebanon crisis. So now you've got another crisis where the combined airstrike force X-Ray Tango has to be deployed to the Pacific, and PACAF takes a lot of aircraft, land-based aircraft like F-101s, F-100s, B-57s, and they place 5 B-47s from Strategic Air Command on alert in Guam. And they have certain naval assets that are put out there, Marine Air Group 11s put out there. And then you have the Organic Republic of China Air Force itself being armed with new Sidewinder missiles. And you start seeing an artillery clash between the PLA and the nationalist forces on these Channel Islands that are very close to the mainland. And I'm talking about thousands of artillery rounds fired a day. So on 23 August 1958, with all these other crises going on, Mao decides to act and press the issue and starts shelling these islands. And he actually attempts an amphibious assault. on one of the islands that's pretty dramatically repulsed and results in failure. But Op Plan 2558, the Air Force tactical plan to take out all of the PRC's war-making capability with 62 targets using atomic weapons from these tactical strike force is put into motion. So all the assets are quickly forward deployed across the Pacific, and we're using islands like the Philippines, got Clark Air Base on Luzon, you're using Kadena and Okinawa, you're using air bases in Japan, you're using air bases on Taiwan itself, as well as the US Navy with their carriers off the coast. And this quick bug-light fashion concentration of air power is key in the deterrence of Mao's government in pressing the issue, because now you've got situations where Brendan kind of talked about this rift, right, between the USSR and the PRC, where Mao really wants to take this to the next level, and the USSR is saying, no, we don't want to go to war right now. Don't do this. The Americans have the advantage right now. We don't want to go to war over this issue. And Mao's really pressing the issue. And this 1958 crisis is the most combat experience that the PLA and the PLAAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, receives in the modern era. So I mean, you've got massive air battles and dogfights between MiG-17s. I've got that pictured right here above us at the very top of the screen there. You got MiG-17s, IL-28s. You've got all these communist bloc air power assets going up against ROCAF. F-86s armed with Sidewinders. The Sidewinders perform well. There's a huge combat element to this whole crisis. You've got American advisors on these island bastions in the near proximity to the mainland that are getting bombarded. You've got Americans under fire. They're requesting the Air Force do something, and the Navy does something in response. You've got Eisenhower constantly in meetings during this crisis trying to figure out, what do we do to de-escalate this situation? Where do we deploy forces? How do we deploy them forward to deter? And Mao's not backing down until he realizes that the Soviets are not going to come to his aid in this war, and he is marked on this with 62 targets for atomic attack. And the carriers are also there as a mobile platform as well. And we have to go back to that first slide that we had, where we had the Nimitz class carrier in flames. You got to assume that the Chinese figured out, hey, we need to stop these carriers from being able to come in and project power like this. What are we going to do to make sure that doesn't happen? Hey, we got to get these American air bases off of Taiwan. We got to make sure that we can isolate these American capabilities to come in and forward deploy right on our coast to deter us from getting what we want. And 1958 is that primary first level lesson for Beijing to figure out, hey, what do I need to do to counter American power? I need land-based missiles to make sure that they can stay far away to project their carrier air power. I need to politically disintegrate the American relationship with a lot of these island countries to make sure that they can't forward deploy air power that way. And I need to isolate the battle space. And that's what we're seeing develop today. And also, don't let a good crisis go to waste. If somebody's concentrated somewhere else, somebody's mental capacity is and mental bandwidth is isolated somewhere else, what can I do to push and pull that attitude so I can make sure that, hey, I can get what I want out of this crisis? Never let that go. Never let that opportunity go to waste is what they would have been saying on that. But overall, some of the analysis that we've got here, I pretty much summed it up, so I'm not going to go line by line on this, but there are consequences to pre-war disposition. Crisis creates opportunity, and making sure that we are still maintaining our Pacific Alliance structure to pre-position forces in place in peacetime to make sure that we've got hardened air bases, dispersed air power, trained and operating crews that know exactly what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it, and that we deter the adversary through that dispersion and making sure that there's no concentration of air power that they can take out in one stroke, just like they did in the Philippines in 1941, and utilize the lessons learned from World War II and the Cold War to our advantage today. But with that, we already talked about the disclaimer. I will hand it off to Jose and stop sharing the screen.
Thank you very much, Grant. Jose,
Okay,
you're up.
thank you. Thank you very much. So now, what I'm going to discuss basically is related in a way to the alliance points that were raised by our colleagues here. At the same time, it's also a how do you call this? Something that you have. It's prequel, okay, to what I discussed in an earlier paper in my presentation several days ago here in the conference. In the conference, I discussed about the current situation in the Philippines and its relations with the United States, okay, and and the revitalization of the alliance, okay. Why? Because we all know that there was the Duterte years. It's just recent memory. Now, the thing that I'm going to say here is that how did that happen? How did an ally, a country that was considered as one of the US's strongest allies, you know, in the Asia Pacific region, how did it turn out like that? Okay, what were the factors that led to that? And if you look at and in fact, it didn't really come out of the blue. Duterte did not come out of the blue. He came out from a process, and all the red flags were there already, even as far back as the 1960s, that inevitably this would happen to the alliance with the United States. So let's talk about that, okay? Why did the alliance, did the Philippines and US turn out in this way? Why, instead of like, if you look at countries like Japan or South Korea, why do you have vibrant, strong alliances with NATO? The same thing also. What happened to the Philippines? Why did it turn out that way? Well, so we go back to the beginning of Filipino-American relations. We must not forget that the Philippines was once a colony of the United States, okay? And that creates creates that particular context, which was a bit different from the other alliances they happened to have. Now, you had the Second World War, which happened in 1940. Sorry, the Pacific War is 1941 to 1945. World War II was 1939 to 1945, unless you include the Sino-Japanese War. Now, but it was the epitome of a solid alliance. You had the Filipinos, you had MacArthur, symbolizing the strong bond between the Filipinos and the Americans. You had I Shall Return and all of those things. In fact, it was such a powerful relationship that in the immediate post-war era, the one of the great Filipino statesmen mentioned something like, where America goes, the Philippines follows in its wake. Something like that, okay, he was saying that. But there were already problems already that were happening, okay? For starters, the atmosphere or the environment of a former colonial ruler and a colony really never disappeared, in a sense. Why do I mean by that? Was that the Filipinos tended to become dependent on the Americans. Why? During the immediate post-war period, the Philippines was building up its resources. It could have gone the other way. How unfortunately, there were a series of problems that happened. Okay, for starters, you had political instability within the Philippines. The Philippines is a colonial creation. That being a colonial creation, it mirrors countries that are artificially created, not because of the activities of the people within, but because of the activities of the colonial power that creates a country out of various ethnicities. Ergo, you have a institutionally, socially fragile country. Okay, and the Philippines was like that. So immediately after independence, we had a rebellion right away, several rebellions, in fact. And then it made the Philippines look internally, okay? But at the same time, because the rebellions were always being contained, it could participate in its responsibilities within the region in the 1960s, okay, 1950s and 60s. We actually had a credible military defense at that time. Our forces, again, this was because of the American largesse, okay, that all, I mean, we were practically bankrolled by the United States military or the U.S. government. So our fighter jets, our tanks were all products of FMS foreign military sales and military assistance programs and things like that. We even got our fuel from Clark Air Base for the Filipino Air Force, for the Philippine Air Force. So what would this create? This would create a dependence on the Americans, okay? And as the Philippines sank into internal problems, okay, and you had here the Marcos dictatorship coming out in the early 70s. The balance between external defense and internal defense could not be maintained because, again, there was now more instability. Then you had the Muslim uprising that began in the very late 1960s and early 70s and raged through most of the 1970s. Then you had the rise of the communist the communist rebellion, a renewed communist rebellion, because it was our first one in the 1950s that was successfully defeated by a combination of American and Filipino efforts. Okay, and of course, to the leadership of Ramon Magsaysay, who was a very charismatic Filipino president who unfortunately died in a plane crash. But then in the 1960s, you had renewed a communist rebellion, and in this situation, you then had the Philippine military looking internally. Then you had a dictatorship in the 1972. Therefore, a dictator, what does a dictator do? He basically reorients everything to look internally. And when that happened, it was goodbye external defense. And with the U.S. presence in the Philippines, external defense now became a role of the United States military for the Philippines. You know, the Philippine military take care of internal, U.S. military takes care of external. Okay, there would be a modicum of support. The last time we bought a fighter jet was actually through American grants again, which was the Crusader in 1978, 79. We got the Crusader, and that was the very last time we bought a fighter jet. Okay, just to show you how external defense just really fell by the wayside as the decades wore by. Okay, and the Philippines became internally focused, and that reliance on the security umbrella stunted the national defense and national security perspective of the Philippines. It stunted it. It made it look internally. And then, because of dictatorship, you had massive corruption going on. Okay, and this would have bearing later on. But the U.S. it didn't mind. You know, it just looked at, hey, Marcos is our boy. You know, as there was a saying in Latin America, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. Okay, but that would have a an impact. Okay, because by the early 80s, dissent against Marcos was growing in intensity. That the U.S. was frequently being criticized by Filipino opposition of becoming partial to Marcos or supporting him. And the U.S. was never really able to work out its way out of that situation and that perception. That is why when Marcos fell when there was a revolt in 1986 and Marcos was ousted, well, of course, predictably, the United States spirited him out. Okay, which further cemented the view that the United States was the one backing up this dictator. But that had very serious implication to Philippine and United States relations. Why? Because with the new administration of Aquino that came in, Corazon Aquino, there was with her, a large number of Filipino opposition figures who didn't like the United States. And what would be the effect of that? The non-renewal of the United States military bases agreement in the early 1990s. And that was a misstep, I think, for the Philippines because it created a vacuum in the South China Sea because you had no more US bases. And we all know who entered: China by the early 1990s and mid-1990s when it seized the Mischief Reef in the 1990s and then threatened Scarborough Shoal. Okay, and that of efforts to modernize the Philippines military was falling by the wayside. But guess why? Because the Philippines could not get out of its strategic perspective that U.S. defend externally, Philippines defend internally. You couldn't outgrow that overnight, you know. So as the years went by after the withdrawal of the U.S. bases, the Philippine military was beginning to lose capabilities more and more. And that's why we had the Visiting Forces Agreement in the late late 1990s. Okay, so it was renegotiated. Why? Because the Philippines, the Philippines straitjacketed itself into, you see, opposition to the Americans led to an opposition to foreign bases in the Philippines. So we had in our constitution, foreign bases are not allowed. The next problem is that because there was an anti-military sentiment in the Philippines at the same time, okay, because again, Marcos dictatorship and the military rule, in the Philippine constitution, there was also a cap on how much could be spent for defense. Education should be more than defense. So how can you now modernize your military if you're straitjacketed by so many by so many constitutional restrictions? So, who are you gonna call? You can't call the Ghostbusters. You call back the United States. And so, in Visiting Forces Agreement comes back. Americans get this treaty that circumvents now or satisfies the constitutional requirement. However, okay, is it all and well and good? No. Why? Because China notices something. Because of the corruption in the Philippines, they notice that, hey, we have a loophole now in the Philippines. We can enter it not through military, but through its political elite. Okay, because they're freaking corrupt. I'm sorry, this is a conference. They're corrupt. So you had Filipino politicians being wooed by the Chinese. And during the Arroyo administration, there was a series of scandals when Chinese companies were bribing the administration officials, the Filipino or specifically the president and her husband. Okay, and that's why she went to jail for it during the second Aquino administration. And that however was already a warning of that the Chinese were already slowly encroaching in the Philippines. What was once an American preserve was not anymore. Okay, and then but you had Aquino administration, the son of Cory Aquino. You had the second Aquino administration. He was pro-US. He actually did a lot for the alliance system. You had expansion of agreements, the EDCA, and other agreements that allowed for more American presence in the Philippines. Unfortunately, he only had a 6-year term, and the Chinese were very busy. And then the problem was with the Aquino is that he was jailing all of the corrupt politicians. But he forgot something, which was called continuity. If you're going to jail someone, make sure that he or she stays in jail. Okay. Unfortunately, he miscalculated. The opposition ganged up on him, and in 2016, we had Duterte. And there are a lot of speculations that China invested heavily in Duterte's candidacy. Okay, because prior to that, there were reports of Chinese presence coming into the Philippines. Okay, so now we have Marcos. See, that's one thing nice about the Philippines is that we have. It's like you're like, hey, wasn't he the president before? Oh, he's president again. So no, it's the son. Same with, and so you have repetition of names. Okay, Marcos Senior, Marcos Junior. Then you had Aquino the mother, Aquino the son. You had Macapagal now, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now you have Marcos. Is it going to be Is it going to be back to the good old days for U.S.-Philippine relations? Well, not really sure. At this moment, we have the Philippines. You had at this moment the chief of staff of the Philippine Armed Forces or the Armed Forces of the Philippines went on public saying that there's a military destabilization against President Marcos, Bongbong Marcos. So what does that mean? Well, as a soap opera would go, let's wait for the next chapter. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Jose. That is a very broad survey in a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
And rather sobering to a certain extent, if I do say so myself. So I did want to exercise moderator's privilege. I did have a couple of questions I'm gonna one for Brendan, and then one I'm gonna ask Grant and Jose kind of jointly. Brendan, I'm going to start with you since you batted lead off. You get lead off on the discussion too. One of the things that came up during the reign of Kim Il Sung, and has continued with his son and grandson, is the North Korean philosophy of Juche, self-reliance, loosely translated. And so I'm curious, how much has this been a factor in some of the trends that you've been talking about, and how much is that today? And what does this, it almost seems like this a support to Russia appears to be contrary to that. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about how much of a factor that is as we think about North Korean foreign relations.
Well, okay, I'll end off with the support to Russia. But so in the historic sense, Juche, self-reliance, I think it has impacted relations, but it did depend on who Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Il were working with. It's a little bit of that of who's the leader of the country that I'm working with, and it's also with the end goal to become self-reliant. And I'll tie that to kind of the current situation too. So Kim Il Sung was trying for self-reliance. I mean, basically in the 1960s and 70s, but wasn't quite able to get there. And I think that's something that North Korea has been struggling with is they can't completely cut ties and be self-reliant. Because of some of where they're spending their money, of purely being in the military sense. Because Juche isn't just self-reliance in a military sense; it's also in an economic sense and a political sense. And so, obtaining all three of those is a very, very difficult thing, especially with, I mean, in the current day, a lot of sanctions, a lot of different things that the North Koreans have been trying to invest in, and so I think the self-reliance of their military is the first step, and I think that's where we've seen Kim Il Sung attempting that in history. Kim Jong Il also attempting that, and that's where I think we're seeing Kim Jong Un. And before I touch Ukraine, I'll touch the example of kind of his relationships, or his relationship and his meeting with President Trump. And so it almost seemed like Kim Jong Un is trying to follow Juche, because President Trump was recognizing almost a political self-reliance at that point in time. Is that President Trump was saying, okay, I'm recognizing not just South Korea is there, but also North Korea is that regional leader, is that North Korea is a sovereign nation, and that's a big deal. But then I think that's why relations then deteriorated, was because Kim Jong Un liked the idea of being a sovereign nation, being identified as a sovereign nation. But the moment that the United States then wanted to impede on nuclear proliferation, some of their nuclear programs, and their military, that's where those relationships immediately deteriorated. And then Kim Jong Un was looking at PRC and Russia as their key allies at that point in time. With the Ukraine situation, I still think that Kim Jong Un is following Juche, even with providing support to Russia, is presenting the idea that the DPRK can do that, is showing that North Korea is so self-reliant and has such a strong military that they are able to provide that support to someone that has been a historic, I mean, at times superior to them. So it's kind of shifting that mentality of that. No, now North Korea is the most powerful. They are the ones providing that support, and of course they're also making sure that one of their largest and most strategic allies is supplied and survives, and ends the Ukraine conflict in a good state. So I think that's kind of the span of history and now with Juche.
Very interesting perspective. I appreciate that. Grant and Jose, I'm going to throw this one to you jointly. because I think it ties into both what elements of what both of you talked about. Grant, you actually gave me the basis for the question when you said, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste." And I was reminded, when we think about the network of U.S. alliances in the Pacific, and in some respects the network of Chinese alliances, which Brendan was talking about, Chinese, the North Koreans, the Russians. Don't let a good crisis go to waste also was bandied about in Vienna in 1914. And if you think about the network of alliances in Europe that then plunged us into the First World War, my question to both of you is, do you see that necessarily as a potential issue? And one of the things I know, Jose, the flashpoint in the South China Sea that has been opened, and you alluded to, I'm curious, how you would react to that. And if you see, is it too tangled a web in terms of where we are, in terms of alliances, things of that nature, or is it an effective deterrent? I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. It's easier to ask the question than answer it, perhaps, but I'll throw it up to the both of you to see for perspective.
Well, I think, Chris, the key, so the key word within your question, I think, is deterrence. And what does losing deterrence really do? And it's really cool that you brought up the crisis and deterrence factor of this, because I actually found a direct quote from the post-action analysis of the 1958 crisis for the American Air Force. And it says, and I quote, U.S. intelligence concluded initially that the communists were testing U.S. and Chinese nationalist reaction and might try to seize one or more of the islands if not convinced that the United States would intervene. Now, what's the main theme of what we see right now on the news? Is deterrence working? Right? Will it work? What has happened to American deterrence? Is it gone? I think I have a hard time answering that, as far as, you talked about the World War I analogy where people are so intertwined and intertangled with alliance systems. I think those alliance systems are actually weaker now than they were in 1914. I think they're a lot more ambiguous now than they were in 1914, which is kind of ironic to me. Right now you've got a crisis in the Middle East that is testing the resolve of the Americans, and really asks whether or not that deterrence is still there. And then, you've got multiple crises going on. You got one in Europe, which is a big one that'll hit the 2-year mark here in next February. And then you've got the Middle East crisis that's going on right now, who no one really knows how long that will last and how far that'll spread. And then you've got the Pacific, which seems to me, feel like a loaded gun right now. I haven't been alive long enough to really see a lot of these crises. So I don't really know how to react to all these different ones that I see, because, the older I get, the more I start to realize, like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. This makes more sense. Let's compare it to this historical crisis. And I find it's more and more difficult to answer questions like that, because, the breakdown of deterrence seems to be a common factor. When people don't think that people are going to do something in response to what they're going to do, that leads to a miscalculation, that leads to shots being fired, right? Same thing in 1958 with Mao deciding, hey, I'm going to bank on the fact that the Soviets have my back, and the Americans are distracted because they've landed multi-division force in Lebanon with all kinds of air and naval assets. They don't have time to think about me right now. Is that the same kind of conversation happening between the Politburo and Beijing? Is that the same kind of conversation Xi's having with his people? Is that the same kind of conversation that the North Koreans are having in Pyongyang? Or are they asking themselves, is this a good crisis? Is this something we can take advantage of? And I think I strayed away from your original question, but I would answer it with only time will tell. And I think that the Americans have to do the best that they can to make sure that they apply pressure where they need to, retain strength where they need to, but also have that willingness, that flexibility to respond and deter multiple crises at once, because that's what we're really seeing. But Jose, I'll kind of kick it over to you if you have any thoughts on that.
And I felt that, I really felt when he said that I'm not yet old enough to know about the previous crisis. I really felt that because I do recall the Vietnam War in a sense that I actually remember I can remember in my head the news when South Vietnam was overrun by North Vietnam and the surrender in the occupation of the presidential palace. I remember that. So I think I'm that old already to know to know what now falls under the category of contemporary or modern history, to have lived through that. And but going back, the thing is that we can see, and having lived through that period, I have seen the evolution of responses. Okay, how 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 um how resourceful opponents can be, to each other. Okay, so um uh, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union tried to match the United States, you know, but with an economy that was terrible, it collapsed. Okay, it could not. I mean, Reagan's SDI was touted to be the one that really undid the capability of the Soviet Union to to um, to face and be a credible rival to the United States. Okay? So it collapsed. Okay? But now, if you look at it, the opposition gains the system, you can see the creativity. Yes, there may be crisis. Like for example, we have what's going on in the Middle East, as you did mention. We have what's going on in the Philippines, in the South China Sea. Okay, but the way I look at it is that it's still being, in terms of a fruit or of a flower, it is still waiting for it to blossom, or it is still waiting for the fruit to ripen. To use those terms. As and why do I mean that? These crises are meant to test resolves. While there are other paths to undermine the the United States, for example, or the Philippines, for example. And there's a common thread there. Look, for example, look at the Middle East and the Middle East conflict now, and the Chinese in efforts against the Philippines. You will see one common thing. The common thing there is that they go through social media. Okay, they go through other avenues. Okay, so could you very imagine? 20 years ago, an attack by Hamas a terrorist attack of Hamas of that magnitude would have resulted in a resounding rejection in the United States. I would guarantee that, in terms of having observed how the United States thinks, a generation or two generations ago. Now look at it. Okay, it's split. Okay, and what is the effect of that? The effect of that is that young politicians, for example, in the American left, as they mature, as they get older, they will become the tools to implement policies now that will, in effect, undermine what's going on. Same in the Philippines. That's why they're gaming. The Chinese, in the sense of the Philippines, are gaming our politicians. Because through the politicians, they can affect national policy. So now the battlefield is not anymore just in the high seas, okay? And the high seas is just meant to create crisis, yes. But at the same time, it's not just, you should not just focus there. You should look at your home front, Unlike before in the 1900s, the whole the capacity of an enemy to influence the home front of a rival was limited. Okay, but now it's not. It's instant. It's very instant. You can just practically so you can practically do it by social media. You can do it by there's an I word that I have difficulty in using, but you know what I'm talking about when I say the I word. They use people to go, and mold the society in a way. That's why we see in other countries what's going on. And there's pushback against that type of movement of people. So that's how I look at it. We're still in that situation where things are still being molded, and I think there's more to come.
That's very good. That's very good. Dr. Saxena, did you have anything to add, or is there any other questions? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat.
Yeah, I just I'm curious to know from Grant, like you just showed us land-based power. If we see that the US have some like military and forces there in the Korea and US Korea forces there, how do you see that now if the conflict arises in the South China Sea or in the East Asia, so how do you predict the land-based power of the US compared to China?
Yeah, so it's specifically concerning land-based forces, in regards to, like, ground units. I think the Western Pacific is a difficult place for those guys to kind of interact, but land-based air power, it really depends on what the situation is. I'm not going to go real deep into like dispositions and stuff like that are current, but overall in general, you have to cultivate the capability to concentrate forces in the immediate area, in the region quickly. And by concentrate, I mean be within striking distance, right? Not concentrating it in one place. So you mentioned the Korean Peninsula. If you only had forces in the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Okinawa, which is included in that, and then the U.S. bases in the Marianas, right, like Guam. If you only had a concentration of land-based air force capability there, your enemy's targeting list becomes very easy, right? It becomes very narrow. And that way you have this massive amount of rocket force, missile forces, air forces taking off from that central spring on the continent and mainland China. You have all of this force that's built up, capable of springing outward to affect all these American bases. And by all these American bases, it's I mean, it's you can count them on your fingers, right? What we're really trying to get at, or what I'm trying to really get at, is you need to cultivate people like the Philippines. You need to cultivate people like Malaya, Singapore, Australia, Indonesia. You have to build up these relationships for a common partnership to make sure that, hey, if this aggressive nation is going to commit aggressive acts, what can we provide as far as air power to deter that in a very dispersed capability, a very dispersed way, so that target list grows and it becomes so long that the target weapon pairing is going to be so difficult that it creates that deterrence. It creates that, man, I can't do it this year, I got to do it next year. And then that next year comes and they lay the plan out and they say, oh, can't do it this year, got to do it next year. And that's what you continuously had in relation to the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact, where that military capability gap between the Soviets and the West was so that the Soviet general staff would say, hey, we can do it. We can attack the West, but here are the consequences. God, I can't take it. That's too much. And that's where deterrence comes in. So when you talk about the, American bases in Korea, the American bases in Japan, wherever they are, it has to be dispersed. It has to be grown. The relationships have to become better, have to become tighter. We have to provide a better alternative than what Beijing can provide in order to create the means by which we can affect the battle space. So, and like Jose talked about, the political relationship between all of this is very much so. It's very closely related. Because if you can't get the policy to be created to implement the combat capability, that combat capability is never going to be there. If the political relationship isn't there, if the politicians don't make the decision to implement a policy that leads to the combat deployment, there's no combat deployment. Right. So, and yeah, Chris, you talked about, was that the ABDA command, right? I saw you mentioned
even before Pearl Harbor, there were
right.
staff talks between the United States, the British, and the Dutch in the fall of 1941. And the war short-circuited that, but the idea was combined naval operations. And it was a very similar philosophy, in this case, countering Imperial Japan, trying to leverage the available assets so that when the time came, they'd be able to concentrate and operate in a combined, to use the modern parlance, way.
Right, and obviously those talks didn't go too much in depth as they should have, or coordination didn't go into too much as depth as it should have, because the outcome of that ABDA command was.
Well, actually, it's you hit on it already. The politicians made the decision too late, particularly with the reinforcement of Singapore, to really start. Okay, it's time to cooperate, and that was a decision that was made only in the summer of 1941. So they were definitely racing the clock.
Yep, and a big theme. I'm gonna quote Doug MacArthur here. What are the 2 words that can be used to describe every military failure? Too late. Right?
Yeah.
That planning piece. I mean, it's kind of ironic that he used that because of the Bataan campaign. I think he could have had a mixed bag on that, but regardless,
We should do a podcast on that, Grant.
yes, we should. Sounds like it, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Actually, I think the answer to that question and that answer actually tie up, I think, a lot of what we've been talking about in this conference over the last few days. I think it's been an outstanding exchange. Tonight has been great. I really appreciate everybody's perspectives. As we conclude, I simply want to say I'm Chris Kolakowski, one of the co-chairs of the conference, along with Indo Saxena. Excuse me. I would like to thank our knowledge partners and everybody that helped with putting this conference on. Our knowledge partners, specifically the Wisconsin Veterans Museum here in Madison, Wisconsin, the Amity Institute of International Studies in Uttar Pradesh, India, and the American International University in Bangladesh. They've been outstanding to work with. And I would also like to thank Dr. Indo Saxena of Rutgers University, who has done absolutely outstanding work, both putting this conference together, managing all the disparate time zones with everybody from Asia to the islands to Japan to North America, and getting everybody together and moderating and helping put on all the sessions. It's been a great conference. We're going to do this again next year, I'm sure, and look forward to more great discussions. But thank you very much. I will throw it back to you, Indo, if you have anything else to say. Otherwise, we'll call it good for 2023.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, team, for supporting this and for cooperating at every moment, and whosoever just supported directly and indirectly this conference. Thank you, everyone.